Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member. I too would like to say what an honor it's been to serve with Congressman Ted Poe, my dear friend and colleague. We came into Congress together 15 years ago, and I'm going to miss you on a lot of levels, but you have served your country well, sir, and thank you so much for that. I'd also like to thank Congressman Smith for his leadership on this PEPFAR extension. Since its inception, the program has provided life-saving drugs to over 14 million people. And I was recently at Texas Children's Hospital at an event with the president of Botswana, who basically described how this program and what the doctors at Texas Children did was saved his country, in his words, from extinction. It's not very often we get to pass legislation in the Congress and hear that we saved a country from extinction because of a bill that Congress passed. So, Congressman Smith, thank you for bringing this up again. It's vitally important, not only to Africa, but to the world that we reauthorize this. And the importance of that program cannot be understated, and I applaud the consideration of it again. Turning my attention, I wanted to highlight two measures that I introduced, the Global Fragility and Violence Reduction Act, which I wrote with Ranking Member Engel, and the Trans-Sahara Counterterrorism Partnership Act. Both of these bills coordinate a whole-of-government approach to fight global terrorism at its root causes. Too often when global crises emerge, the United States commits financial and other resources to immediately address the problem. While we must continue to tackle such imminent threats, we must do more to prevent threats from emerging in the first place. This makes me think back to 2001. Prior to 9/11, Afghanistan was not a foreign policy priority of the United States. It was barely on anybody's radar. And so were the embassies in Africa and the USS Cole and the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center. But 17 years later, we're still in Afghanistan, committing significant resources to rebuilding that country. Afghanistan was what we call a fragile state. Broadly speaking, these are countries where the government loses legitimacy in the eyes of its people and struggles to govern. What if we could identify so-called fragile states ahead of time and prevent them from failing? That is why I helped introduce the Global Fragility and Violence Reduction Act. This bill requires the administration to launch a global initiative to reduce fragility and violence, guiding our efforts to help fragile states down a path towards stability. The bill also requires the Department of State, in coordination with USAID and the Department of Defense, to identify 10 countries or regions as pilot programs to start this new initiative. Since each fragile state is different, this initiative is flexible to address the causes of fragility in each case. One area of the world where state fragility and violent extremism currently persists is in North and in West Africa. Since our operational successes against ISIS and the collapse of the caliphate, many of their fighters have splintered and fled to Africa, where other terrorist organizations have flourished. Today, it is estimated that 10,000 ISIS and al-Qaeda jihadists have already set up camps across the continent, with Boko Haram and others having spread terror for years. These terrorist organizations pose an immediate threat, and we must work with our regional governments to build their capacity to blunt these terrorists. My bill, which I introduced with my friend Mr. Keating, authorizes also from the first time the Trans-Sahara Counterterrorism Partnership to aid our efforts to help fight these terrorists in Africa. This program works alongside countries like Chad and Mali and Nigeria to build their capacity to conduct counterterrorist operations. This partnership also enhances the ability to monitor, restrain, and interdict terrorist movements and strengthen the rule of law. Furthermore, my bill requires the State Department, USAID, and Defense Department coordinate on a counterterrorism strategy for Africa and deliver that strategy to the Congress. State fragility, and by extension, violent extremism, is a major foreign policy challenge for the United States. But by taking a multifaceted, multi-layered approach, as this bill does, we may be able to avert larger crises. It's interesting to note, I mentioned 10,000 jihadists in Africa, and prior to 9/11, there were just several hundred al-Qaeda operatives, several hundred, and they pulled off 9/11. And now today, while I do believe the threat has gone down with the collapse of the caliphate, the fact that there are still thousands of these jihadists in northern Africa and the Sahel gives me great concern and great pause. And so with that, I'd like to thank the ranking member and Mr. Keating and all the members of the committee for their support of this legislation. I yield back.